There is a moment, one single, ordinary Sunday morning moment, that over 70 people in a small American town still cannot explain. They have tried. Believe me, they have tried. Some of them prayed about it. Some of them lost sleep over it. Some of them quietly packed their families into their cars and never, ever went back to that church again. And the ones who stayed? They don't talk about it. Not to strangers. Not even to each other. But one woman, an elderly woman who was seated in the very front row that morning, she agreed to speak. And what she described was not what any of us would expect to come out of a Sunday church service in America. She looked at me with completely steady eyes and said, very slowly, whatever was standing behind that pulpit at the end, was not a man anymore. Pause. What does a congregation of more than 70 people do when they watch their pastor, the man they trusted with their souls, the man who baptized their children and buried their parents, transform into something they cannot name? What do you do when the man at the altar stops being a man? When his body starts changing right in front of your eyes? When the screaming starts and people are running for the exits and others are frozen in their pews, too terrified to move? What do you do when faith itself becomes the most frightening thing in the room? This is the true story of Pastor Daniel Ray Whitfield. A charismatic, beloved, deeply trusted leader of a small Appalachian church in rural eastern Kentucky. A man whose name was spoken with reverence for nearly 2 decades. And a man who, on one February Sunday morning, shattered every single thing his congregation thought they believed about him, and possibly about reality itself. Before we uncover what truly happened in that church, I need you to do one thing for me: subscribe right now. Because the stories on this channel dig into moments that people wish had never been recorded, and trust me, you will not want to miss what comes next. More than 70 people were sitting in those pews that Sunday morning. 70 men, women, and children, mothers with babies on their laps, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers fidgeting with their bulletins, farmers who had driven 30 minutes down winding mountain roads just to be there. 70 ordinary Americans who came in expecting a sermon and a hymn and a handshake at the door. And instead, they got something that cracked their world wide open. What exactly did they witness? Why did some of them bolt toward the exits while others were completely paralyzed with fear? Why do certain members of that congregation, even years later, go pale and quiet the moment someone brings up that morning? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, why did the investigation that followed uncover something hidden deep in the basement of that church that no one was supposed to find? To understand what happened inside those walls, we cannot start with that Sunday morning. We have to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the man the community thought they knew. Because nothing about what happened that day makes any sense unless you understand who Daniel Ray Whitfield really was, and what he had been doing in that church for years when no one was watching. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Grace Covenant Fellowship sat at the end of a gravel road just outside the small town of Harlan County, Kentucky. It was the kind of church that had been standing since before most of the congregation's grandparents were born. White clapboard siding, a modest steeple, a hand-painted sign out front with a Bible verse that changed every week. The parking lot had potholes nobody ever fixed. The fellowship hall smelled like old wood and coffee and casserole dishes. On Sundays, the parking lot filled with pickup trucks and minivans, and the sound of hymns drifted out the open windows and down through the hollow toward the creek below. Daniel Ray Whitfield had been the pastor there for 19 years. He had grown up just 12 miles away, the son of a coal miner and a schoolteacher. He went away to a small Bible college in Tennessee, came back with a degree and a calling, and never left again. The congregation loved him the way small communities love the people who choose to stay, with a deep, almost protective devotion. He was the kind of pastor who remembered every birthday. Who showed up at the hospital without being called. Who sat with grieving families through the whole long night when there was nothing left to say. A member of his church, a woman named Carol, remembered it this way: he made you feel like you were the only person in the room. When he looked at you from that pulpit, you felt like God was speaking directly to you. Not to the congregation. To you. He was, by every outward measure, an extraordinary man. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a voice that could fill the room without a microphone. He was magnetic in that particular way that great preachers are magnetic. He drew people towards something larger than themselves, made them feel the weight of something holy. Parents brought their teenagers to his sermons specifically because he had a gift for reaching the young and the skeptical. He had turned around marriages. He had guided people through addiction. He had, by many accounts, genuinely changed lives. And for 19 years, that was the only story anyone in Harlan County knew about Pastor Daniel Ray Whitfield. But there was another story. One that had been quietly writing itself in the shadows of that white clapboard church for years. And it began, as these things often do, with something small. Something almost easy to explain away. It started with the late nights. Members who drove past the church after 10 o'clock began noticing the lights still burning inside. Not unusual for a pastor working late on a sermon, except this was happening 4 and 5 nights a week. Then came the change in the sermons themselves. Long-time members noticed a new thread running through his messages. Where he had once preached about grace and forgiveness and love, he began dwelling, Sunday after Sunday, on something else entirely. Transformation. The shedding of the old self. The ancient scriptures that spoke of men being remade. He would lean forward over the pulpit and his voice would drop very low, and he would say things like, "There are forces in this world that are older than the church. Older than the Bible. Older than us. And they are patient. They are waiting." The congregation would shift in their pews. They would glance at each other. But Pastor Whitfield had always been a passionate preacher, and passion can look a lot like strangeness from the outside, so they let it go. They trusted him. Then came the locked room. In the basement of Grace Covenant Fellowship, there was a storage room that had always been used for extra folding chairs and old hymnals and the kind of miscellaneous clutter that accumulates in church basements over 100 years. At some point, nobody could say exactly when, Pastor Whitfield began keeping that room locked. He told the deacons it was for safekeeping. He told the janitor it contained valuable documents. But one Sunday afternoon, a young choir member named Jessica, 19 years old, curious in the way that only the young and brave are curious, stayed behind after rehearsal and walked to the bottom of those stairs. She stood outside that locked door and she listened. And she heard something moving on the other side. Not footsteps. Not papers shuffling. Something slow. Something deliberate. Something that dragged softly across the floor. She went home and did not sleep that night. She told her mother. Her mother told her she had an overactive imagination. But she never forgot what she heard. The changes in Pastor Whitfield accelerated in the weeks leading up to that February Sunday. People who saw him in passing, at the gas station, at the hardware store, at the small grocery on Main Street, noted that he seemed distracted. Not unkind, just elsewhere. Like a man carrying a thought too heavy to set down. He lost weight. His face took on a gaunt, hollowed quality. His eyes, several people remembered, seemed different somehow. Darker. More intense. One church elder, a 72-year-old man named Raymond who had been a deacon at Grace Covenant for over 30 years, pulled him aside one Wednesday evening and asked if everything was all right. Whitfield looked at him for a long moment, and Raymond later told investigators that the pastor's expression was one he had never been able to fully describe. Not troubled. Not frightened. Something closer to certainty. Like a man who has made a decision and is no longer negotiating with himself about it. "I told him I was concerned," Raymond said. And he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Raymond, everything is exactly as it is supposed to be." And I wanted to believe him. Because that's what you do with a man you've trusted for 20 years. You want to believe him. The choir rehearsals became uncomfortable in a way nobody wanted to name out loud. Whitfield would sometimes slip into the sanctuary while they were practicing and sit in the back pew in the dark, watching them. Not menacingly, or at least, that is what they told themselves at the time. Just watching. When the director would acknowledge him, he would smile and wave and eventually leave. But there was something about being watched in the dark by a man who had started preaching about ancient transformations that made even the most faithful members of that choir feel a particular chill they could not explain. The noises from the basement grew harder to ignore. The janitor, a quiet man named Gary who had worked at that church for 11 years, reported hearing sounds he described as hissing. Not a leak. Not a pipe. Something biological. Something alive. He knocked on the locked door one Thursday evening and called out to the pastor, and the sound stopped immediately. Then Pastor Whitfield's voice came from the other side of the door, perfectly calm, telling Gary he was fine, he was studying, he would lock up when he was done. Gary went home. He handed in his resignation the following Monday and never publicly gave a reason why. The sermon 2 weeks before the incident is the one people remember most. Pastor Whitfield stood at the pulpit on a cold January Sunday and preached on the story of Moses and the serpent. Not an unusual text for a Pentecostal church, the handling of serpents as a sign of faith has roots deep in the Appalachian religious tradition, grounded in the 16th chapter of Mark, where the scripture reads that believers shall take up serpents and shall not be harmed. But members of Grace Covenant had never practiced snake handling. That had never been part of their tradition. So when Whitfield began speaking that Sunday about the ancient relationship between mankind and the serpent, about how the serpent in the garden was not simply a villain but a transformer, a force of change, a creature that had been misunderstood for millennia, the congregation went very, very quiet. One woman in the middle rows leaned over to her husband and whispered, "What is he talking about?" And he had no answer for her. After the service, a small group of longtime members gathered in the parking lot and spoke in low voices. Something was not right. They all felt it. But none of them could have imagined how not right it was about to become. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever been in a place, a job, a relationship, a situation, where something deep inside you was telling you to leave, to speak up, to ask the hard question? And you talked yourself out of it because you trusted the person across from you? Because you had known them for years? Because admitting something was wrong meant everything you believed in might be wrong too? That is exactly where these people were. And that is what made what happened next so devastating. February 14th. Valentine's Day. A cold, clear Sunday morning in eastern Kentucky, the kind of morning where your breath fogs in the air and the mountains look blue and still in the distance and the gravel crunches hard under your tires. 73 people walked into Grace Covenant Fellowship that morning. Some of them brought flowers. A few of the teenagers had red and pink candy hearts in their coat pockets. The elderly couples sat in their usual spots in the front rows, the ones they had occupied for decades, the ones that felt as permanent and belonging as their own living room chairs. The music started at 10:15. The congregation sang. The offering plates went around. A woman from the women's ministry made announcements about the upcoming Valentine's potluck. Everything was exactly, precisely, perfectly normal. And then Pastor Daniel Ray Whitfield walked out from the back room and stepped behind the pulpit, and the first thing everyone noticed was that he was sweating heavily. The church was not warm, it was February, the old heating system barely kept up, but Whitfield's shirt was visibly damp at the collar, and his face had a sheen to it that made people in the front rows exchange glances. He opened his Bible. He looked out at the congregation. He smiled. And the smile was, several witnesses later used this exact word, wrong. He began preaching. His text was the same passage from Mark he had referenced 2 weeks before. But his voice was different that morning. Strained. Thick. Like a man speaking through something that was pressing against his chest from the inside. He was gripping the sides of the pulpit so hard that his knuckles had gone white. The woman named Carol, who had spoken so warmly about him just months before, sat in her usual pew 5 rows back and found herself gripping her Bible with both hands without knowing why. Her daughter, sitting beside her, tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Mom, is Pastor Whitfield okay?" And Carol had no answer. He paused mid-sentence. A long pause. The kind of pause that does not belong in a sermon, the kind that makes a room full of people hold their collective breath. His head dropped forward. His shoulders heaved once. Someone in the back called out, "Pastor." A few people rose partway from their seats. And then, in a motion that nobody in that room was prepared for, his body pitched forward behind the pulpit and he went down hard. People rushed forward. A man named Thomas, a former EMT who attended the church with his wife, got there first. He rounded the pulpit and knelt beside Whitfield and reached for him, and then he stood back up. He stood up fast, the way you stand up when something does not make sense to your hands. He looked at the congregation with an expression that nobody who saw it has ever forgotten. He opened his mouth. He did not speak. And then the sound started. Later, when investigators interviewed the witnesses separately, they used different words to describe what they heard. Some said hissing. Some said a low, resonant vibration, like a bass note played too close to the body. Some described it as a dry, rhythmic sound, like something moving through dry leaves. But they all agreed on one thing: it was not a human sound. It did not belong to a man lying on the floor of a church. What happened next is where the accounts diverge, and where things become almost impossible to report without acknowledging that what these people believe they saw has never been fully explained. Multiple witnesses, interviewed independently, described the same sequence of events. Whitfield's body appeared to be changing shape. His limbs, they said, seemed to elongate. His neck, and this detail comes up in account after account, appeared to extend, to lengthen in a way that a human neck does not lengthen. His skin, seen by those closest to the pulpit, seemed to have taken on a different texture. A mottled quality. Several witnesses described seeing something massive where the pastor's body had been. Something low to the ground. Something that moved with a fluid, sinuous motion that no human body is capable of. His body started twisting, said one man, a deacon named William, who was among the first to reach the pulpit. I can't explain it better than that. It was twisting. And the sound, that sound was everywhere. A woman in the 3rd row screamed. That was the trigger. Once one person screamed, the room came apart. People were on their feet, stumbling over pews, grabbing children, running toward the exits. A Bible hit the floor. A collection plate clattered from a pew. The front doors burst open and people poured out into the cold February air, some of them barefoot because they had kicked off their shoes running. A few members, the very oldest, the ones whose legs could not carry them fast enough, pressed themselves against the back wall and could not look away. And what they saw, what the elderly woman in the front row saw, the one who agreed to speak, was this: something massive and serpentine, coiling slowly behind the pulpit of Grace Covenant Fellowship. Something that had scales where there had been skin. Something that filled the space behind the altar the way a man never could. Something that turned what might have been a head in the direction of the congregation and regarded them with an intelligence that was ancient and cold and utterly, utterly still. Then someone pulled the fire alarm. The sound shattered the moment. And within seconds, the room was empty. Stop for a moment. Imagine you are one of those 73 people. Imagine you are sitting in your usual pew, the one you have sat in for 15 years, next to your husband or your mother or your child, and the man you have trusted with your deepest fears and your highest hopes and your children's baptisms, the man who held your hand at your parents' funeral, is suddenly no longer a man. What do you do with that? How does your mind make room for something your entire life has told you is impossible? How do you walk back to your car? How do you drive home? How do you sit at your kitchen table that afternoon and explain to your kids why you left church early? How do you ever go back? If you're still watching, drop in the comments what state you're from. We want to know how many of you are following this story all the way through. The emergency call came in at 10:47 in the morning. The dispatcher reported multiple callers, most of them crying, many of them incoherent. The first responders who arrived at Grace Covenant Fellowship found a scene unlike anything in their combined experience: dozens of people standing in the parking lot in the cold, some without coats, some clutching children to their chests, some simply sitting on the gravel with their heads in their hands. A few were praying aloud. No one would go back inside. The police entered the church to find the sanctuary in disarray: pews shoved sideways, hymnals on the floor, a pair of reading glasses crushed near the center aisle. The pulpit area showed significant disturbance. And in the corner behind the altar, coiled with a kind of terrible patience that the first officers on scene later described as deeply unsettling, was a timber rattlesnake. Massive. Over 6 feet in length. One of the largest specimens the county wildlife officer had ever seen. It was alive. It was unhurt. And it was alone. Of Pastor Daniel Ray Whitfield, there was no sign at all. The investigation that followed consumed the next several weeks. Investigators from 3 different agencies worked the case. And as they worked, the true picture of what had been happening inside Grace Covenant Fellowship began to emerge, piece by piece, like something being unearthed from deep ground. What they found was not supernatural. But it was deeply, profoundly strange. And in many ways, it was more disturbing than anything the congregation could have imagined. Witness testimonies were collected over the following days, and they told a story of mass confusion, genuine terror, and the kind of panic that can genuinely alter perception. Multiple psychologists who reviewed the case noted that under extreme fear and psychological stress, the human brain is capable of remarkable distortions. A man collapsing behind a pulpit, in dim light, with a large snake that had escaped a hidden container, the mind of a frightened person, in a charged religious environment, with weeks of unsettling sermons priming their fears, could conceivably interpret that combination of inputs in extraordinary ways. Could, in seconds, layer what they had been told to expect over what they were actually seeing. That is the clinical explanation. That is the rational, documented, peer-reviewed explanation. But here is what the investigation also found. In the locked basement room, authorities discovered something that had clearly been accumulating for months. Wooden crates. Modified containers with ventilation slots. The kind that experienced handlers use to transport and house venomous snakes. They found shed skins, multiple shed skins, pressed flat and kept, almost reverently, in a wooden box. They found books. Dozens of them. Books on serpent mythology. Ancient texts on transformation. Theological writings on the tradition of snake handling in Appalachian faith communities, a practice that stretches back over 100 years in the hills of Kentucky and Tennessee, rooted in those specific verses in Mark that Pastor Whitfield had been preaching so obsessively in the weeks before the incident. They found handwritten journals. Pages and pages in Whitfield's own hand, densely written, filled with scripture citations and references to transformation and to what he called the shedding of the false self. The journals became more fragmented, more urgent, as they approached the final entries. The last entry was dated the Friday before the Sunday incident. It read, in its entirety, Sunday. It is time. The deacon Raymond, when told about the journals, sat in silence for a very long time. Then he said, quietly, he wasn't losing his mind. That's what scares me. He knew exactly what he was doing. As investigators dug deeper into Daniel Ray Whitfield's past, a history emerged that the congregation of Grace Covenant Fellowship had never been shown. He had not always been a conventional pastor. In his early 20s, before Bible college, before his return to Kentucky, he had spent nearly 3 years traveling through Appalachia, attaching himself to small, remote, serpent-handling congregations. These were the churches that outsiders rarely saw, tucked into hollows and up dirt roads, existing almost entirely outside the awareness of mainstream religious culture. The kind of churches where the services went long into the night, where the music reached a pitch of intensity that the uninitiated found overwhelming, and where the handling of venomous serpents was not theater or spectacle but the most serious possible demonstration of faith. A test between the believer and God, conducted in the presence of creatures capable of killing a person in under an hour. Whitfield had been bitten twice during this period. Both times, according to people who were present, he refused any medical treatment. Both times, he survived. For people inside the tradition, this was not luck. This was evidence of the anointing. This was the mark of a man who had genuine faith, who had been tested and had not been found wanting. And for the young Daniel Ray Whitfield, it appears to have been the most formative experience of his life. He eventually left that circuit, went to Bible college, and built the respectable, conventional pastoral career that the Harlan County community knew. But he never stopped believing. He never forgot what he had learned in those years on the road. And at some point, nobody could say exactly when, he had begun moving back toward it. A former friend of Whitfield's, a man named Eddie who had known him since childhood and who had briefly accompanied him on part of that early Appalachian journey, agreed to speak anonymously. He said, "Danny always believed that the serpent tradition was the most honest thing in Christianity. No pretending. No hiding. You either have faith or you don't, and the snake doesn't lie to you about it. It doesn't care who you are or what you've said in your sermons. It only cares what's real inside you." Eddie paused. But later on, it went somewhere else for him. He started talking about something more than faith. He started talking about becoming something. About humans being capable of a transformation that the church had taught us to fear instead of pursue. And I didn't follow him there. I couldn't. The congregation became, in the weeks and months after the incident, bitterly divided. The rational faction, largely the younger members and those with some college education, firmly embraced the explanation that the whole event was a case of mass hysteria, triggered by the escape of a large snake from whatever containment Whitfield had been keeping it in. The panic spread through the room the way panic always spreads, instantly and without reason, one person's scream becoming everyone's nightmare within seconds. The brain fills the gaps with what it has been prepared to expect. This is documented. This is science. This is what happened. The other faction, the older members, the ones who had been there longest, the ones who had sat closest to the front, would not be moved. They had seen what they had seen. The woman in the front row, the elderly woman who had sat in that same spot for 31 years, said this, "I know the difference between a man falling down and a large snake getting loose. I raised 4 children in these mountains. I have seen snakes my whole life. What I saw behind that pulpit was not a man who had fainted. And it was not just a snake that got loose. What I saw," and here she stopped, and when she continued her voice was very steady and very low, "what I saw was a becoming. I don't have another word for it. He had been working towards something for a long time. And on that Sunday morning, whatever he had been working toward, it arrived." Ask yourself honestly, if you had been sitting in those pews, if you had known that pastor for 20 years, if you had heard those sermons building week after week to that Sunday morning, which explanation would you be able to live with? The scientific one, that settles everything and explains everything away? Or the one that leaves room for something you cannot name? Daniel Ray Whitfield was never found. This is the part of the story that investigators cannot explain away with mass psychology and the escape of a large snake, the part that sits at the center of everything like a stone you cannot move. He was not found in the church. He was not found in the surrounding woods. His car was in the parking lot. His wallet was in the pulpit drawer. His phone was on the lectern where he had set it before the service, still showing the scripture passage he had intended to read that morning. There was no evidence of flight. There was no evidence of foul play. There was simply an absence where a man had been. A man who had, by all accounts, been inside that church moments before the congregation evacuated, and who was simply, impossibly, not there when they returned. The timber rattlesnake found behind the altar was removed by wildlife officials and transferred to a research facility. It was determined to be wild-caught, not bred in captivity. It was, as noted, over 6 feet in length. It was described by the wildlife officer who removed it as unusually calm for a snake that had just been in the middle of a human panic. It sat, she said, with a kind of patience that she found difficult to characterize. They're cold-blooded, she said, so they're always calm in a technical sense. But this one. She did not finish the sentence. Grace Covenant Fellowship closed its doors 3 weeks after the incident. The congregation could not reassemble. Some members transferred to other churches. Some stopped attending church entirely. The building sat empty through the spring and into the summer. By autumn, the hand-painted sign out front had faded beyond reading. The parking lot slowly filled with weeds pushing up through the cracks in the asphalt. The windows stayed dark. No official explanation was ever confirmed. The missing persons case for Daniel Ray Whitfield remains open. The books and crates and journals from the basement were catalogued and eventually filed in a county evidence warehouse. The shed skins were photographed and documented and stored in sealed bags. Raymond, the deacon who had served the church for 30 years, moved to live with his daughter in another state. He still attends church every Sunday. When his daughter once asked him if he believed what he had seen that February morning, he thought about it for a long time before answering. "I believe," he finally said, "that there are things in this world that a man can want badly enough, and work toward long enough, and pour himself into completely enough, that the man he used to be eventually becomes unrecognizable. I don't know if that's a miracle or a warning. I suspect it might be both." The elderly woman from the front row still lives in Harlan County. She still goes to church, a different one, smaller, with a younger pastor. She sits in the back now, near the door. When asked whether she ever thinks about that Sunday morning, she said she thinks about it every single day. She was asked what she thinks happened to Daniel Ray Whitfield. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He found what he was looking for." Whether that's a blessing or a tragedy depends on whether you believe that the thing he was looking for was real. And I have spent every day since that Sunday morning trying to decide what I believe. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she looked back. "I still haven't decided." To this day, no official explanation has ever been confirmed. The case of Daniel Ray Whitfield and what happened at Grace Covenant Fellowship on that February morning remains exactly what it was the day it happened, an open question. A crack in the ordinary world that was never sealed back up. And maybe that is the most unsettling thing of all. Not the snake. Not the chaos. Not the locked basement room or the hidden journals or the shed skins in the wooden box. The most unsettling thing is that a man who was deeply trusted by 73 people, a man who showed up at their hospitals, who sat with them in their grief, who was, by every account that matters, a genuinely good pastor for most of 2 decades, had been living a secret life inside the building they thought they knew. And none of them saw it coming. And all of them had to ask themselves, afterward, what that meant about trust. What it meant about the people we let into our lives and into our faith and into our children's formative years. What it meant about the gap between the face someone shows the world and the thing they are slowly, quietly, deliberately becoming in the dark. After that day, not one of them ever looked at their pastor the same way again. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. What do you believe really happened inside that church on that February morning? Was it mass panic, triggered by an escaped snake and weeks of psychologically priming sermons, transforming a frightening but ultimately explainable event into something supernatural in the minds of terrified people? Is that enough for you? Does that account for the elderly woman in the front row, with 31 years of mountain living behind her, who insists with absolute calm that what she saw was a becoming? Does it account for the man who simply was not there when they went back in, no car gone, no wallet gone, no phone gone, just a man-shaped absence in a room full of evidence of who he used to be? Or do you believe something else? Something that sits in that space between science and faith, between what we can measure and what we cannot? Something that says there are traditions in this world that are older than our comfort, older than our explanations, and that occasionally, when a person is willing enough, and driven enough, and has been walking towards something long enough, those traditions deliver exactly what they promise. Put your theory in the comments. Seriously, I read every single one of them. Is it mass hysteria? A staged disappearance? Something medical that manifested in terrifying ways? Or something that none of those categories can quite hold? There is no wrong answer here. These are real questions. They deserve real thought. And I want you to think about this too, because this is the part that I think lands differently than the rest of the story. 73 people trusted this man completely. They handed him their spiritual lives. They brought their children to him. They sat in his services and opened themselves up to whatever he was offering from that pulpit. And the whole time, in the basement beneath their feet, something was happening that none of them knew about. Something was being built, and tended, and worked toward. Now ask yourself, is there a person in your life you trust that completely? A pastor, a mentor, a teacher, a close friend, a partner? And do you actually know what they carry behind the face they show you? Do any of us really know? Because one of the quietest lessons in this story, underneath all the drama and the chaos and the snake in the corner, is that trust, real trust, requires more than familiarity. It requires attention. It requires the courage to ask the hard question, even when the answer might change everything. The people of Grace Covenant Fellowship stopped asking. They saw the signs, the locked door, the changed sermons, the weight loss, the late nights, Jessica standing at the bottom of those stairs listening to something she couldn't explain, and they talked themselves out of their own instincts because they trusted the man at the front of the room. And that trust, as real and as earned as it had been for 19 years, ended up being the very thing that left them completely unprepared for what he had become. If this story unsettled you, good. It should. Not because pastors are dangerous, and not because faith is wrong, and not because you should walk into your church this Sunday with suspicion instead of openness. But because the lesson inside this story is not about snakes and it is not about the supernatural. It is about the danger of confusing duration with depth. Of confusing familiarity with knowing. Of confusing the face someone shows us with the fullness of who they are. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, hit subscribe right now. Because the next story we are uncovering involves a church recording that was never supposed to be heard, an audio file that surfaced years after the events it documents, and that has never been fully explained by anyone who has listened to it. And if you thought the story of Grace Covenant Fellowship was disturbing, I promise you, the next one will leave you asking questions you didn't even know you had. Every week, we dig into the stories that fall through the cracks of the official record. The moments that don't fit neatly into the explanations we're given. The people and places that show us the edges of what we think we know about the world we live in. Subscribe so you don't miss a single one. And thank you, genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, for watching all the way to the end. It means everything.